This is the McKinsey podcast, where we help you make sense out of our world's toughest business challenges.
Welcome to the show. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
What I do think is near term, though, is many more nations, many more private companies are going into space, and they will start to explore, for example, on the moon. And the question for everyone out there is, how do we make sure that even in those early steps that, again, we're all being responsible?
That's McKinsey senior partner Ryan Brookhart, whose research predicts the space economy will be worth $1.8 trillion by 2034. Ryan joins us to discuss the growing space economy and how to shape it responsibly.
In our second segment, author Moshe Temkin talks about his book, Warriors, Rebels, and Saints, The Art of Leadership from Machiavelli to Malcolm X, and what history can tell us about the types of leaders we need today. This comes from our Author Talk series.
Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me today.
So, space has been at the forefront of our human collective imagining about the future for decades. So I get the allure overall, but I would love to hear a little bit about your own background and the origins of your particular passion for space as a profession.
Sure, yeah. And to your point, it's been around a long time, and it's gone through cycles of excitement, I think, in the broader public. And I got caught up in that, right? I think as a child, you look up and you look at space and you see the stars, and to be, maybe it's a little bit corny, but that is a bit where I started. And then, I grew up in the 80s with the space shuttle launching periodically here in the U.S. and seeing those astronauts. And I went to space camp, and then I got a degree in physics and went into the Air Force and all these things. And space has always been a passion for me, and it's great here at McKinsey to be able to continue that and to help think through what's going to happen in the industry and how it's going to affect not only, our clients and whatnot, but also every person on Earth, frankly.
And so you alluded to space going through cycles. For context, what has happened in recent years that has made space more accessible than in some years past?
It's kind of interesting. I mean, most people probably don't realize just how much their daily lives interact with space. Every day, people get in cars that are assisted with navigation by GPS. Every day, people order food online that is assisted by both communications as well as navigation that is provided by space assets. The presence of space in our lives is probably a bit more ubiquitous than people think. However, to your point, what really has happened in the last several years is the access to space, the ability to get to space the cost of that has come down dramatically. And as you might imagine, when you're trying to put assets onto orbit, it can be very expensive. And so through a variety of technological advancements, as well as entrepreneurship and private investment in particular, we've seen those costs come down.
Yeah, I think your point about space being more ubiquitous than people expect is such an interesting one. So we're not talking about space tourism here, at least exclusively, right? We're talking about something that's much broader than the kind of flashy going up for however many minutes in a ship that people talk about.
Yeah, that's right. Most of the capabilities that we have from space are done by satellites and by other unmanned platforms here in Earth orbit. So yes, I mean, space tourism is a part of the space economy, and people are going to space for a variety of reasons, not to just live and work there and for scientific purposes, but also for fun. That will increase. However, it is a bit of a smaller part of the economy today.
Now let's turn to the research, starting with the definition of what we're calling the space economy. What do we mean exactly when we use that term?
In the past, it's been a bit nebulous, which is why we actually did the report. I think trying to put real bottom-up, sort of definition around what the space economy means was why we set out to do this report to begin with. And I think the way we think about it is there's two large halves, if you will. One half is the backbone, is what we call it, and that's some of the stuff that we were talking about a moment ago. It's launch vehicles, it's rockets and satellites, and all of the ground equipment that makes all of those things work. And then the other half is what we call the reach. And the reach is really the applications and the use cases that leverage that backbone in order to provide the goods and services to people on Earth, basically.
So before we get into the specifics on applications and use cases, talk to us a bit about the capabilities that industries will be able to leverage via investment in space.
The way we think about it is in three buckets. The first one of connectivity is this whole idea that today we have the ability to communicate basically anywhere in the world, right? Using satellite technology and satellite communications technology. What has really happened over the last several years is the fact that we can now do that with what's called, high bandwidth and low latency. And basically, that means that we can send a lot of data very quickly. And the types of use cases that allows are for things like video conferencing, et cetera. The second one is this whole idea of what we call mobility. And, we touched on this a bit in terms of GPS, at least to use the American constellation of global positioning satellites as context. But this whole idea of understanding where you are, on the Earth. And we do that with cell phones, but increasingly we'll do that with even smaller devices so we can know where anything is in the world if it's tagged with these small devices. The third one is deriving data that only space-based applications can provide. And so I think you see this in Google Maps, for example. If you open your computer, we see this, what we call electro-optical imagery, or imagery that allows you to see what's happening on the Earth. And it used to be you might take a picture of the Earth, company or a government may do that once a day or once a week. Now we're able to do it very, very often. And what that means is that you're able to use not only visual data, but also other types of data on a high return aspect to see what changes. And that can be useful, right? If you think about crops, for example, understanding how much water there is to feed those crops and what you may need to do about that, what actions you may want to take. So this whole concept of connectivity, mobility, and then inform is the way we think about it.
Let's pick up the GPS example. Is this improved, more accurate positioning data something fundamentally different from GPS? Is it better GPS? And why do we need it? What will we use it for?
Two aspects, right? One is, yes, it has gotten much more accurate. And so that allows certain use cases to emerge, right? And the second thing is the ability to detect those signals. It used to require these big antennas, these big receivers. Now you can do it on your cell phone. But pretty soon you'll be able to do it with a very, very small, low power sticker even that you could put onto an asset. And so when you think about those two pieces, what it allows you to do is a couple things. One, here in Western economies and where technology is more accessible to the general population, even expensive receivers like cell phones and whatnot can allow you to get food delivered to your house. Well, now in other places where receivers are becoming less expensive, you'll see those use cases now extended to other geographies. And I think the second thing is additional use cases, right? You can get in your car and take your phone and it'll help you navigate to where you want to go. But in the future, we'll be able to track containers on ships, for example, to understand where they are, understand when they'll arrive somewhere else, and be very discreet in the tracking of them. And so both the proliferation of old use cases to new geographies, as well as new use cases that didn't exist before, are what's going to drive the growth.
That's interesting. And just bringing that tracking issue to the individual level, I live in New York City. We've got like a constant dinner table discussion about wearables and tracking because my kids are beginning to be at large, terrifyingly. So we talk in the research about personal tracking services through wearables. What are the applications here? And is this the end of actual privacy? Is privacy a quaint anachronism in this satellite era?
What I would say is that the regulatory environment in general for space is still maturing. And in some previous research we talk a lot about the balance between allowing for innovation and technological advancement and the freedoms that we would want to be able to do that without the burden of regulation and governments. However, to your point on privacy, I think there is an idea that we need to have the appropriate amount of regulation to be able to manage not only things like privacy, but also we're sending a lot of things into space. And so how do we manage that? What's the air traffic control, quote unquote, system for that? We talk about management of bandwidth, right? Responsible management of bandwidth to make sure that, folks are able to do their communications, whether it's satellite or otherwise, in a responsible way. So I think this whole idea of privacy, needs to come through an effective regulatory environment. And that's still catching up. I think that's the rate of technological innovation in some ways has outpaced that.
Talk to us about disaster warning and management.
Yeah.
What role does space-based technology play, and what's the business opportunity here?
When you talk about disaster response, what the idea is, there's a couple aspects to that. One, being able to give the response agencies and governments that are involved real-time information about what's actually happening in a very clear and concise way. The second thing we can do through space is communications, right? I mean, often in disasters, communications go down, right? And for emergency responders and governments to be able to effectively communicate, as we've seen in many disasters in the past, is extremely, extremely important. And then there's other aspects to it as well in terms of what information can we derive, from the Earth. So, for example, we talked about mobile signals to understand where people are. Well, people still keep their cell phones on in an emergency, right? There are actually commercial technologies out there that can understand, where those mobile signals are, so that the government can understand where people may be in trouble.
Another opportunity the research highlights is in-orbit servicing. That is covered as a genuine opportunity for the space market. Talk to us a little bit about that opportunity. Is the expectation that existing satellites can be upgraded and repaired, or that they'll be replaced with new and improved ones? And then in the latter case, what happens to the legacy equipment?
Yeah.
Does it come down, or is it just up there in space interminably?
There is this tension right now in the industry between sort of upgrading and repairing satellites that are on orbit, and you would only do that with a certain type of satellite, but there's that tension, versus do we just put new satellites up to replace the old ones? And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. And I think that the technology currently, and the way it's been moving, is that there's a role for both of those technologies. I think there is, going back to the regulatory question, it's getting crowded up there. And, we're launching, at least here in the United States, every 3 days. And there is a real, concern around these satellites, frankly, running into each other. And what do we do about that? How do we manage that?
And to your point about evolving regulation, whose responsibility is it to pick up the garbage in space?
That is a hotly debated topic. Many satellites that are in what we call low Earth orbit or lower orbits, it's a little bit self-cleaning. So they will degrade in orbit and they'll burn up in our atmosphere, and they're just sort of gone, right? There are satellites that are far away from Earth where, to your question on on-orbit servicing, to be able to repair and upgrade and put more fuel into those satellites, in some cases makes sense. So when you ask who's responsible, I think the large Western governments and other governments are struggling with that right now. What requirements do we put onto people that build the satellite, people that launch the satellite, in order to ensure that space is free and open for the future? And what does that mean? What cost comes with that?
In the research, you talk about backbone investments, which include satellites, launchers, and services like broadcast television, GPS. Do you see investment continuing to be largely state-sponsored, or is there an obvious commercial opportunity in that area?
Well, I think what we've seen over the last 10 years where, frankly, we've gone to launching a few times a year, and that's globally, right? To now, if you look at all the countries that are spacefaring, we're launching every other day or so. I mean, this is it's a phenomenal change over this time period. And that's due to a couple of factors, one of which is technology and technological improvements in launch itself. Some of that is reusability, like you talked about. Some of it is leveraging the commercial scale and scope of certain technologies. And then the other one is private investment, right? I think this has been a huge difference in the last several years, as governments will always be very important. For many space companies, their anchor customer, really private capital coming in and starting to explore more commercial use cases is one of the other big things that's changed.
So a criticism that we sometimes hear about investment in space, or at least certain segments of the space economy, is that there's a genuinely urgent need to address challenges right here on Earth. Now, you have alluded to some of the ways that the space economy improves our lives on the day-to-day, but talk to us specifically about ways space might actually help advance progress towards sustainability goals.
when it comes to how can we affect life on Earth, why would we invest there versus other places? I'd point to some of the use cases we talked about. I mean, the ability to provide essential access and then essentially full access, to the global knowledge base, to places in the world that are underserved or unconnected. I mean, that's huge, right? I mean, it allows for education. It allows for understanding of what's happening in local communities as well as more broadly. Well, to understand what's happening and in some cases actually hold others accountable for what's happening on the Earth is something that really only space and some space assets, can provide. And then I think the third one is really around, there are a whole bunch of new technologies that are allowing us to better understand, things like carbon, things like methane, et cetera, where we didn't understand some of the sources or it was hard to pinpoint them or it was hard to address them. Well, we're actually able to provide some of that information and the analytics around it to allow not only private industry to take action, but also governments. I'll give you a discrete example. I mean, if you think about a utility, maybe in Europe, right, that has to make a choice every day about, do they turn on some kind of a power plant that relies on fossil fuels or do they rely on wind? And if they make the wrong choice, quote unquote, the wrong choice, they're going to be relying on those fossil fuels. However, with some space-based assets, we can do better on predicting how good the wind will be. And if they don't turn on that fossil fuel generator that day, well, that's carbon that doesn't get released.
And related to this, one of the issues that makes headlines is mining in space. For example, lunar resource extraction, which seems potentially complex ethically, geopolitically, et cetera. Any thoughts on considerations businesses might need to keep in mind in that area as space becomes increasingly commercialized?
That's pretty far off, right? Our ability to extract, certain minerals and whatnot from either asteroids or from other planetary bodies like the moon, responsible extraction, responsible use, how that all works are pretty far away. What I do think is near term, though, is, as you noted, many more nations, many more private companies even are going into space, and they will start to explore, for example, on the moon. And, the question for everyone out there is, how do we make sure that even in those early steps that, again, we're all being responsible and cleaning up after ourselves and being responsible and working, well with others and being respectful of others and being responsible and taking care of all of our natural resources, whether it's on here or other places.
In the past, space was really a locus for geopolitical competition, the space race. We've obviously seen geopolitical risk intensify across the globe in recent years. Is geopolitics a factor in the economy of space? And if so, how?
Short answer is yes, and it always has been. If you look back into the 60s and the 50s, there were a couple of countries that were in a space race, right? And that generated a massive industrial base in those countries. As that race went on, it generated a lot of economic activity and a lot of technological advancement. And at the end of the day, some pretty spectacular achievements from all those in the race, during that time period. And if you look today, we're in another geopolitical environment where living and working and utilizing space for national security purposes is going to continue to increase. There's maybe more players that are going to be doing this and being involved in space. And you can see in the number of space agencies that have come up over many years. It used to be a very, very small number. And now you see many in the Middle East. You see many, in Asia. You see many more even occurring in Europe. And so the interest in space and the use of space and in some cases, unfortunately, the exploitation of space is going to be an integral part of many countries' national security construct.
Are there any other benefits you want to highlight that the space economy might confer?
One thing that it really is helping with in many countries is job creation, and in particular, science and engineering type jobs where there frankly weren't any. So if you think about a country that is seeing the space economy develop, even if they can't launch astronauts from their own soil, what they can do is they can provide high-tech components for satellites, for launch vehicles, et cetera. And so we've been working with some clients to think through, if they were to do that in their country, what does that mean for their own economy and for the development of their own universities and whatnot. And it's pretty interesting, right? If you think about, if you want to engineer and design high-tech components that are going to be launched into space, you need to have engineers and scientists that understand that technology. You need to have universities that can produce those. you have to have, a secondary education system that gets people interested in it. And so, there are many countries that are thinking through how this emerging space economy can come all the way back into how they think about the education systems in their countries, and frankly, where over the next 20 years, they're going to generate economic returns for their GDP.
What are the biggest challenges to the space industry at the moment?
Well, we touched on regulation, so I would say that's definitely one. The second one is there is a tension between how many players, whether it's private players or whether it's governments. We don't necessarily want a domain of titans, right? We want free and open use, right? And then, and kind of how is that going to evolve? I think the third one really is how rapid some of these technologies will be applied to different types of business problems, right? And it's on this third one where we spend a lot of our time with client work and working with clients in the mining industry and the agriculture industry, for example, to think through, how can they use those capabilities we talked about before, communications and mobility and different types of analytics to solve their own business problems, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you're an executive that's, working in a particular industry, it doesn't really matter how you fix your business problems, space or on the ground or some other technology, Gen AI. What they really want is better outcomes for their own customers and better outcomes for their own employees.
You've said in the research that the space economy is at an inflection point. Talk to us about what you expect to happen in terms of the dynamics of growth in coming years.
The short answer is we're going to see significant growth in the space economy, over the next 10 years. When we set out on this journey to think about what's going to happen in the economy, we didn't want to use some top-down number. We actually wanted to think through all of the use cases that are out there, both government use cases as well as private sector use cases, and build bottom-up this projection, right? And we think that's important because what's really going to happen is the space economy is going to almost triple in the next 10 years, from about 630 billion to 1.8 trillion. And we talked about this whole concept of backbone and reach. And I think, frankly, as someone that works in the space industry, we have a hard time talking about the reach, right? We like to talk about satellites and launch vehicles. And it is really the reach that's going to propel the space economy from that 630 to 1.8 trillion. It's an exciting time, right? I mean, that's why we say we're at this inflection point as more and more folks on Earth benefit from it, and more folks on Earth figure out how to use those capabilities.
Should private sector leaders put space on their agenda? And if so, how should they think about incorporating space into their strategy?
Well, space is the final frontier, right? So it's, everybody needs to have it in their strategy is the way we like to think about it. Look, I think in this period of rapid change, right? And not just in space, but across many industries, we really want to see how the capabilities that are provided in and through space and the excitement that, frankly, we're seeing in and around space. And what we really want to do is to leverage a bit of that excitement, a bit of that technological change, and a bit of that passion to say, space is really, it can really change the world even more than it already has done. And how can that work in your business? How can that work in your government? How can it work for your people, right? Whether they're employees or whether they're residents, right? I think that it can and will continue to touch the lives of everybody throughout the earth. And I know that it sounds lofty, et cetera, but we believe it is true, and it is only going to be an increasing part.
Okay, Ryan Burkhardt, thanks so much. Live long and prosper.
Thanks for having me here.
Next up, what can CEOs learn from dynamic leaders in history? Here's author and Harvard fellow Moshe Temkin to tell us.
We can't understand really transformative, important leaders without understanding the history that shaped them, that made them, the world in which they came up. It's more of a question that never has a clear answer, because for every important leader that you look at, you'll find that that leader is sort of forged, made, shaped by history and the circumstances that that leader faces. But also really important leaders then change things and they create transformation that make the world different. So they make history. If you take the types of leaders that are in the book, you really find three kinds, I think. The first is people who have power. You can talk about presidents. You can talk about people who have institutional or formal power. Then there's a second group, for example, the suffragists who were fighting for the right to vote for women, or Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X, who were fighting for the African-American struggle in the 1950s and 1960s. They're not at the head of state. They don't have formal power. They have some power, and they find alternative sources of power to achieve the kind of change that they want. And finally, I think there's another category which is very interesting, and that's where the opposition comes from. Because opposition means sometimes that you're quite literally in danger. So think about, let's say, the French resistance during World War II, or people who were escaping slavery in the 19th century in the United States. These are people for whom the stakes couldn't be higher. It's life or death. And their opposition to power is quite literally putting their own lives and sometimes the lives of others at risk. So it's really interesting to see leadership in that context. How do you lead when you have no power? If I try to translate this into the business world, I think really the interesting question is, let's say you're part of an organization or a corporation. You're not at the top. You have some power. You might decide that you want to replace the power. That's a very tricky thing to do inside an organization because that can cost you your own career, your own success. But I think by creating alliances, by being strategic, right, by thinking about what are the strengths and weaknesses of the person above you, sometimes the person at the top, you can find ways eventually to realize your own goals, your own ambitions within that hierarchy. And then the list of problems and challenges that we have is a long one. The question is are we going to be able to find the leaders and the leadership we need? And I see those leaders. I see them. They're not known yet, and they're not famous. But when we identify such people, then we need to encourage them. We need to rally around them. We need to help them, support them. And if people who are listening to this view themselves as such leaders, then they shouldn't be shy to try to step up and do the things that need to be done. Because ultimately, for me, leadership, true leadership, is a form of public service.
Thanks so much for listening to the McKinsey podcast. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
Find us on McKinsey.com. We'll have a transcript of this episode up shortly.
And download the McKinsey Insights app, where you can find this podcast and other helpful content updated daily.
If you enjoyed the show, we'd love for you to leave a rating and a review.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.